Hi, this is Chris German from the Apartment Dealer bringing you another one of our guest interviews. This is where we go out into the marketplace and interview those pinnacles within the real estate industry who can either share tactics, strategies, or mindset to help you move your portfolio and, more importantly, your financial legacy forward. With me today is Mr. Steven Spierer. Steve brings with him over 4 decades experience of litigating real estate law, but more notably, has ownership, either personal or through partnerships, in over 1,000 doors, 1,000 units, both in California and out of state. And so he brings that practical knowledge of not only the litigation side, but as well as being a landlord himself. So Steve, thank you for being with us.
Chris, it's always a pleasure. Thank you.
Maybe to give our audience some context, those who haven't had the pleasure to see you at one of our educational events, maybe a little bit about your experience as a lawyer, what type of cases you try, and then just a little bit about your ownership experience, how that started and how it got so large.
Well, thank you. I have been practicing real estate and business law exclusively for 41 years in Southern California. We represent clients all over Southern and Northern California, and everything having to do with real estate, business, and the associated estate planning that goes with it. For the same 41 years, I've been investing in real estate along with my partners and our investors, and we own commercial, industrial, retail, and about a little over 2,000 apartment units in California, Arizona, Washington, and Colorado. We have our own in-house management that runs all of those. So I'm one of you.
From your vantage point, obviously you have both realtors and landlords as clients. What would you say the psychology of the market is, the general sentiment? We hear wars about tariffs. We hear there might be a recession on the brink. The stock market didn't like the recent interest rates. Now we hear interest rates. Some people say they're going to go way down. No, they're going to go way up. But what's the sentiment that you sense right now?
The predictability is the friend of business and the friend of the markets. Unpredictability is what makes everyone nervous and jumpy, but we've got a different type of unpredictability now than we've had in the past, which is actually, to me, not as dangerous. Interest rates are relatively low, and even if they go up materially, they'll still be low. And real estate makes a great deal of sense, even at increased interest rates when they're moderately increased. The sort of interest rates that we saw back in the late 70s and early 80s, where you might be buying a house at 17% interest, and if you got 13% interest, you thought it was a bargain. We're not going to see that anytime soon, if we ever see it again, but we're sure not going to see it in the next few years. So I think that there can be a good deal of relaxation with respect to interest rates if you are a real estate owner with proper financing in place. Now, if you've got an exploding loan or a loan that's coming due, you need to pay attention to it and make a good deal, get the right advice, get the right loan in place. With respect to some of the other concerns, the effect of tariffs and so forth, these things have a instantaneously observable effect in the stock market. But when you're in real estate, you get a lead time of probably close to a year before anything really happens in the market. So by the time you're standing on any given day making a sale, purchase, or renting an apartment unit, it's all baked into the mix. I think that one of the safest places to be is in properly financed real estate, and to own it and to operate it and to add to the collection. It's like a stamp collection, except it has cash flow.
Now, rent control. We thought we were done with rent control last year. The state had a vote. The population spoke no, and yet here we are. Now we're contending with rent control again, statewide rent control. Funny enough, many of our viewers, landlords that I talk with, they're not even aware that this bill is rapidly moving through in the proper channels to the governor's desk. Let's say we all wake up next month, 2 months from now, the entire state fell to rent control. Many of our owners, because of the markets we work, have no familiarity with rent control. So if you could just give us a brief overview, what is rent control? What do rent caps mean to the landlord?
So Rent control is something which is very frightening. It's akin in the real estate field to when employers found wrongful termination lawsuits or sex discrimination lawsuits, or in the past in real estate, we've seen lawsuits over mold or lawsuits over earthquake issues. It's not as big a bugaboo as it looks like. Rent control is to be taken seriously. Rent control by landlords should be opposed strongly, but business is still going to be conducted. I remember in the late 1970s when the Los Angeles Rent Stabilization Ordinance, rent control, came to the city of Los Angeles, and everyone predicted the market was going to crash and no one would be a residential landlord and you could never make money again in the city of Los Angeles, and it was all wrong. Rent control, even in its most stringent incarnations in, for example, Berkeley or Santa Monica or New York City, is something that a landlord can still live with and work with as long as you make the purchase correctly, as long as you're financed correctly, as long as you're otherwise managing the property correctly. And so when I saw Proposition 10 fail when it came up on the ballot, I didn't look at it and think it will never come back. I thought, all right, that was their first move. There'll be a second move, and then the third, and then a 20th, and then a 40th move. It's coming, and we should all know it, but it can be dealt with, and it can be dealt with responsibly. It will start with the camel's nose in the tent, where they say, for example, 7% on top of inflation, which puts the number at something like 9 or 9.5% a year. Who's raising rents 9.5% a year anyway? So it doesn't pose a current threat. Overall, it's going to add to the housing crisis. And even the people who are in favor of rent control understand that they're making the housing crisis worse with rent control, and they haven't quite figured out what they want to do about that. So there's a schizophrenia in the people who are urging rent control because they realize that at the same time that they're helping some of the people they think they're helping, some of the tenants that exist, they're also hurting some of the other people they'd like to help, who are people who are going to be coming to rent later. And either way, it's going to act as an internal brake on the action and the forward momentum of rent control. Either way, landlords, when the rules get here, need to learn the rules, need to live within the rules, manage the properties within the rules. If you're a slumlord, yeah, you're going to have problems. But if you're running your property correctly and making the appropriate investments and keeping your rents at market while you can, then you'll be best positioned to handle rent control.
So there are a few components of the law. One, as you mentioned, it's as proposed 7% plus cost of inflation. You have what's called the crawlback, or whatever the rents were March 1st of 2019. It'll take the rents back to what those rental rates were, regardless if we pass this law in December or January of next year. Whatever the rents were March of this year, they'll crawl back to that amount. But let's talk just cause eviction, because again, much of our audience is used to, if you have a troublesome tenant, a break in the lease, they just issue a 60-day notice and they can be gone. Not so, you must have just cause. What is a just cause?
So just cause is in the eye of the beholder for the judge. The judge is going to get to decide what just cause is. Just cause is always going to be failure to pay rent. There's not going to be a circumstance where you can just not pay the rent and stay in the apartment, provided that the premises are habitable. But what just cause is going to be is difficult for a landlord to say, gee, I just don't like you. Well, that's going to raise all kinds of questions as to why you don't like me. And so that's going to be a problem. So I think that the just cause issue and a lack of vacancy decontrol and rent control, those are probably two of the bigger threats. But again, the market will operate. And so if you have a tenant who is there and you can articulate reasons specifically why they're detrimental to the apartment complex. So for example, they're disturbing other tenants, or they make too much noise, or they leave their trash in the parking lot, or their car is inoperative and it's in the parking lot. Something like that, that's going to be easy. If it's a single family residence and if those come under rent control, and they might, then it's going to be hard to make any kind of neighbor issues because those won't be the landlord's problem, and the landlord won't have standing to make the argument. But just cause is going to be anything you can articulate as to why that tenant is detrimental to the property. Another example would be they keep food piled up in the kitchen and they're attracting cockroaches and other vermin. Those things are going to make a difference. But what will probably be gone is a landlord's ability to simply decide, I don't like this tenant, so I'm not going to let him live here. That's probably what will be gone. But ask yourself, how often do you actually have to say that? It's not often, because landlords are in the business of renting and tenants are your customers, and you don't want to lose your customers. Vacancies and having to turn the apartments, to clean them up, paint them, touch them up, all that costs money. You want a stable tenant population. It's probably going to make it more important that tenant screening, calling references of past landlords, those sorts of things are going to become more and more important.
And at our educational event, obviously we're going to dig into this much deeper. There's things like cash for keys that we need to discuss, working on the evaluation of a property that's under rent control versus one that's not. But maybe switching gears here for a moment, you mentioned that you actually own over 2,000 units. I said 1,000, so you're even that much more big time these days. But many of our clients say have owned a 5 or a 10 unit building. They've sat on that same property for 20 years. And by the work we've done with our clients to help build portfolios over time, I'm encouraged to kind of evangelize, if you will, these smaller mom and pops to consider growth, to consider at least one 1031 exchange in their lifetime. So personally, why 2,000 instead of 100? Why 100 instead of 10? I mean, because a lot of people perceive more tenants mean more headaches, mean more liability, more mortgages. They see the negative. What's the other side of that coin?
Well, to me, if you really learn how to be a landlord over 2 units or 10 units, once you've really learned how to do that correctly, why not have more? You simply make more money. It's a broader footing. It's not harder. You either can do it correctly or you cannot. And if you have the appetite to do it correctly for 2 or 5 or 10 units, it's not very much different to do it for 20 or 40 units. And when you get to 100 or 200 or 500 or 1,000 units, then you're not the one getting the phone calls telling you that the toilet is stopped up. There are people who are doing that for you because the economies of scale allow you to easily afford professional management, either your own or outside management, who can watch those things and do them for you. If you're large enough, you run your own internal operation with a part-time or full-time person, on-site or off-site, who handles those things for you, and it's very, very profitable. It is the gift that keeps on giving. So if you already are a landlord, I would always say, properly risk managed with proper financing and consistent with your individual personality, temperament, and needs, I'd buy more.
Now, if you can't already tell, Steve is a storehouse of knowledge given, again, his 4 decades of experience. And the format of our luncheon really is you get about an hour, hour and a half free of Steve's time to answer your personal questions. And to give you some flavor of what that looks like, I thought I'd rapid fire with Steve a few questions that were submitted by our clientele, just to get some sense that Steve is very open and candid on stage at our event. It's not, here's half an answer, book an appointment with me, you get the rest of the answer. So I thought this was a good one, Steve. If you purchase a multifamily property, and at the time of purchase, you're only given Estoppel certificates by the seller. Seller claims to have no leases on file, but they have the tenant sign an Estoppel and the landlord signs, or the seller signs that same Estoppel. Okay, you know the monthly rent, you know the deposit, but none of the other terms of the lease. So pets or no pets, smoking, non-smoking location. Are you able to change any of those? How do you govern those items after you've taken ownership and all you have is an Estoppel with a rent and a deposit?
Assuming for the sake of argument that we're not in rent control and that you can negotiate something new, what you would do is you'd go to the tenants and say, hi, I'm the new landlord, and what I'd like to do is set a new lease agreement with you. And so I understand this is your rent and this is your security deposit. Would you like to stay? And if so, here are the terms on which we'd like you to stay, and you negotiate it. And if they have a pet and you want to get rid of the pet, that's going to be more difficult than if they have a pet and you're okay with them having a pet. And it's going to be the same thing with anything from a water bed, if anybody still has water beds, to anything else that they're doing in the apartment. It's a matter of establishing a new relationship with your new tenants and go to them and renegotiate a new lease.
What if a tenant is exiting your property and the damage to the unit exceeds the deposit? What is a landlord to do?
A landlord has the right to make a claim against a tenant for any damage, regardless of the amount. And so what you would do is you document it within the 21 days that you're allowed before the deposit is to be refunded or you need to account for it in writing. You would write a letter to the tenant that would explain that not only are you keeping the deposit for all these reasons, but you have a claim against them in this amount, that you'd like to discuss it with them, and you open a dialogue with them with the idea that you're going to compromise. The reason you would compromise is if you demand every cent of it, it'll be harder to make a deal. If you are willing to compromise, then there's something in it for the tenant to reach some sort of a resolution with you. It's a matter of negotiation. If all else fails, you can sue them. You can sue them in small claims court for up to $10,000 if you are an individual landlord. If you are an LLC or a corporation as a landlord, then your limit is $5,000 for a small claims court. If it's substantially more, then you might want to consider hiring a lawyer, but that's rare, and it really doesn't pay when you get to $10,500. To hire a lawyer and to make it make sense, if your claim isn't worth at least $25,000 or $30,000, it's probably not worth it. The only exception to that would be if a letter from a lawyer or the commencement of a lawsuit by a lawyer would bring them to the negotiating table and enable a settlement, then it might be worth hiring a lawyer, not to take it to trial, but to help you have negotiating power to resolve it.
Now, Steve, our educational event is this coming October 3rd.
I'm looking forward to it.
And you've been kind enough to be with us the last 10 years, but I think over the 10 years, we've probably done 15, 16 of these type of events together. I'm really trying to reach those individuals who are the skeptics. They assume there's a bait and switch, there's a big sales pitch. You really don't give full answers like you just did, but it's a pitch to get people to your law firm to collect a fee. What can you share with those who may be skeptics? What will they learn at the event that they cannot learn from a Google search, they can't learn from an Apartment Owners Association magazine? What sets this apart?
I think that there's several things that set it apart. One of the biggest one is that you get to ask your own questions. So if you've been storing up questions for areas of real estate, for multifamily units and apartments, for financing, for 1031 exchanges, legal questions, lending questions, borrowing questions, this would be a time to store those up and bring them, because those are going to get answered. So that's one reason. The second reason is that Chris has very carefully handpicked the people who show up, and his instructions to all of us have always been that people who show up and have lunch and want to come to this seminar need to leave with something of value. It's not a marketing opportunity, it's an opportunity to share information. If the result is that business comes out of it, that's great. But if no one ever uses any of us, we get the satisfaction of knowing that we've actually helped people who own and operate apartment units to be able to do that more safely, more profitably, with a greater understanding of the rules of the road.
Steve, thank you so much.
Chris, thank you so much.
It's always a pleasure.
My
Thank
pleasure.
you.
Thank you.
Our next Apartment Owners Educational event is Thursday, October 3rd in the city of San Gabriel. Upon watching this video, we are going to open up registration, so registration will now be open. We only have seats for about a couple hundred attendees, so we ask you to respond quickly. And until next time, this is Chris German wishing you positive cash flow, tenants who behave, and much protection from Uncle Sam. Thank you.